We're going to cover a fair bit of territory today, so we're not going to dive deeply into stuff, but we will cover, the key issues, and we're going to split it into two sections. So risks that are on the radar that we know about, but which are still emerging, and over the horizon risks. We kind of know they're there. We don't quite know how they're going to pan out yet. So that's the basic roadmap for today's session. Let's do on the radar. That's the Russian radar station there. First one we've got, ageing infrastructure. Now, we're not getting any younger. Certainly Greg and I aren't getting any younger. Think about your own campus. Our COPE data tells us that a large proportion of Australian universities' buildings, are between 40 or 50 years old. There's certainly some new construction that's been happening and some refurbishment, but in the main, a large proportion of buildings are, in the vicinity of 40 to 50 years old. Infrastructure services that support them are often the same age. Sometimes there's upgrades to plumbing and electricals, but in essence, the infrastructure supporting the building is roughly the same age as the building. What we see is older spaces are becoming less and less fit for purpose, and an underutilisation of assets is, it's rife. I mean, think about how often your buildings get used, right? So, Glenn, what do you reckon the average utilisation rate is?
Probably depends on the space that you're looking at the moment, but lecture theatres at the moment are probably between 5 and 10%. The informal space are the ones that are increasing, but they're on the TEFMA data still capped at around only about 30 to 35% utilisation.
Yeah, they're pretty shocking statistics, really. We're not utilising the spaces that we've got. Now, here's another classic, and this is a really, really important one, and that is the asset maintenance backlog deficits are becoming an issue. Right? So if your asset backlog is around 5% of your total asset replacement value, you're starting to head into the danger zone, right? Because once you get into that 5 to 10% plus area, it spirals out of control. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And with the ageing infrastructure, we're seeing, old switchboards, distribution boards, they're starting to develop hotspots. They become fire risk. And there's lots and lots of them throughout a campus. And we're seeing an increased failure rate in HV systems and in plumbing. And our water damage stats are starting to look pretty ugly, actually. But we'll get to that again in a minute. So what are the risks of ageing? Well, besides me forgetting stuff, there's lots of risks. Building condition deteriorates, and that's related to your asset backlog maintenance deficits, right? And an ageing building presents a range of different property and liability risks. Fitness for purpose. Well, if a space isn't meeting the needs of its users, do they really want to go back there? And it starts to become a reputation risk. And if it's a reputation risk, then it potentially could become a revenue risk, right? So fewer enrolments because, I want to study in a new, nice new university campus. Underutilisation or abandonment of buildings. Basically, the risk there is delayed response to incidents, risk of theft and vandalism, and we've seen this across a number of campuses, the buildings that have been abandoned. Copper's the first thing they go for. Now, I've even been to a building where they were brazen enough to actually rip the copper out of the HV, the high voltage system. Mate, you're prepared to take that risk? Take it. The copper, that is, not the risk. So, as campuses change and develop, there is a lot of abandonment of buildings, and these are the risks that we run. The asset backlog risks relate to building condition and further deterioration spiralling out of control. Ageing electrical infrastructure, it speaks for itself. Fire and business interruption risks. And HV and plumbing, water damage to the building fabric. Right, we're seeing more and more of this. What goes with that? If you don't treat it quickly, mould. Then you've got a denial of access issue. And also, there's the risk of damage to high value equipment, and we are seeing more and more of this. So let's talk a little bit about water damage, and the tagline here is seek the leak, right? So think about a room. So just have a look above you, see what you can see. The pipes, ducting, and other services, they're in the ceiling space, right? You walk into a room, no one looks up. Only risk engineers look up because we're looking for the sprinklers and we're looking for the smoke detection and, all that other stuff that, red pipe. We love red pipe. But most people don't look up. That's where the risk is, okay? Our water pipes can fail at joints. They can even fail in the pipe walls. And I'm going to show you some photos in a minute of what that looks like. Braided flexible hoses, right? Ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Like, when you go back to your campus, have a look for the braided flexible pipe. It'll be under the sink. It'll be next to the toilet. It'll be in the emergency shower thing. They're everywhere, right? We're seeing increasing numbers of failures of these pieces of equipment. So I'm not going to go through what type of pipes can fail, but the one you really don't want to fail is a wastewater pipe. Let me give you the tip. Having worked in sewage treatment, it's not pleasant. I'm going to tell you a story in a minute about the failure of a reverse osmosis system, okay? But the message I want to leave here about water damage with you is check the location and check what's in the ceiling before you put anything of value directly under it, okay? Even HVAC, the chiller coils in HVAC. So those square things on the ceiling that you see, in the university spaces? Often that's connected by ducting, and in the ducting there's a chiller coil. This is a copper pipe that looks like this, and it's joined. And we've seen failures in those joints, and then the water just spills out of that ducting onto the floor and fills up. So here's a couple of photos. Hot water systems. Anyone ever had a hot water service fail at home? Yep. It's problematic. These fail at universities too. Hose reels, look. The reason I had that one in was we do often, well, not often, but occasionally get mischievous students who might want to open a valve and have a water fight, right? And then leave it on. The photo in the top left, or right, sorry, is an example of how a pipe wall can fail, okay? So you see that bluey green stuff? That's the result of corrosion. Now, in the 80s, there was a really bad batch of B-grade copper pipe brought into the country, which effectively was very thin wall. This pipe is probably out of that batch. And with the combination of hard water, and there's hard water around the country, particularly in WA, it can corrode the wall of copper pipe. And this is what's happened in this instance, right? And once that happens, it's hard to control. You basically got to turn the water to the whole campus off. But here's a good story. This piece of equipment is laser equipment. It's worth around, between $400,000 and $500,000. See those blue cylinders? That's a reverse osmosis system. Reverse osmosis is used to provide very, very clean water. Okay, so what we do is we push water through a very fine filter under pressure, and that gets all of the contaminants and rubbish out of the water. When you've got a system that's operating under pressure, there's a potential for stress on joints, elbows, all parts of the system actually. And what happened in this instance was that RO system failed. The water made its way down all over this X-ray tape, this laser table. Right? It wasn't a total loss, but it was a significant enough loss. Unfortunately, the consultation between the research team and the facilities team came up with the solution of putting a screen over the top of this to protect it should it happen again. It wasn't an expensive fix, so the cost benefit of undertaking this exercise was about 20 to 1. It's a no-brainer, you just do it, right? Guess what happened? 2 months later, or thereabouts, the RO system failed again. The laser system didn't get wet. Perfect solution. So sometimes, with these issues, you've got to think a little bit outside the box. You can't always treat the source, so it won't happen, but you can protect your equipment. Who's got an e-bike? Put your hands up. Yeah, I have too. E-skateboard, e-scooter. Any e-scooters? Right, couple. We're going to talk a bit more in detail about this tomorrow, so I'll skip over it, but it is an emerging fire risk. Your EVs, probably not so much. Personal mobility devices, yes. Hand tools and grounds maintenance equipment, definitely. We're seeing more and more fires out of this type of battery. Who's got an electric toothbrush? Who's got earpods? Who's got speakers that have a battery in them? The number of embedded batteries that you have in devices in your house, you would not believe, right? And I'm not going to spoil tomorrow's party, but your phones, your laptops, your wearables. I mean, I don't wear a watch. I can't figure out the IT that goes with all of that stuff, so I just don't bother with it. But, they're all embedded batteries. You see kids walking around vaping. They chuck their vape in the bin when it's half finished. That's an embedded battery. Right? When that goes into the compactor, right, potential for a fire. You've all got uninterruptible power supplies throughout the campus supporting various pieces of equipment. And at some campuses, you've got larger scale battery energy storage systems. It's all lithium ion, right? There's a lot of battery research going on, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But at the moment, lithium's still king. Biggest risk with lithium-ion batteries is thermal runaway. Now, that looks like a pretty bland photo. That's a university campus on the on a university campus in a building on the 5th floor where there used to be a large battery energy storage system. There's nothing in there now because it burnt down. And the fireys who went up to the 5th floor to try and put this fire out, when they opened the door, the backdraft pushed one fella against the balcony, the balcony, and lucky it was about that high, otherwise he would have gone over backwards and on the concrete 5 stories below. Battery damage can happen in lots of ways, right? It can be a faulty battery, it can be damage to the battery from overcharging, it can be poor quality electrolyte. If you've dropped your drill and it's got a battery in it, potentially that'll damage the battery. Once they become damaged, that's when the potential for thermal runaway happens. A couple of tips here. With uninterruptible power supplies, try not to situate them in the same room as the piece of equipment that you're trying to supply to. And whilst battery energy storage systems are relatively rare on campus now, we're suspecting that in the future we're going to see more and more of this, and I'll explain why in a minute. The next on the radar risk is climate change resilience. So the question you've got to ask yourself, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it, right? What we expect to see, and you've all received reports on this last year, with projections up to 2040, 2050, 2090, 2030, 2050, 2090. More consecutive days of 35 degrees plus. Okay, increased bushfire potential, more intense storms. And I didn't write this after Albert, but cyclones moving south, right? Honestly, I did. I wrote it before this happened. What happens, with climate change? What are the risks there? Well, obviously the property damage that comes with it. So water ingress, flooding, wind damage, hail, the list goes on, right? And what's the result of that? Well, potential denial of access to your campus and business interruption risks, right? So how do we deal with this? And, I think the best advice we could give you from our experience is campus master planning needs to address the adaptation issues, right? Your technical specs need to address things like hydraulic loads. So if it's going to rain harder, how much more capacity do we need in our gutters, in our in-ground stormwater systems? So the secret to managing water is to get it from one point to the discharge point as quickly as possible. Material selection, right? Think about your roofs. Metal roofs, clip-lock roofs, usually 0.75 mil to 0.85 mil gauge, right? It's pretty thin. What if we absorbed the extra expense and went to 1 or 1.2 mil gauge, right? So we know that's 0.75 mil gauge, it's going to get damaged by a 4 centimetre hail. We know that, right? We've seen it. If we increase the gauge, that might help. So we're trying to get some data on this at the moment to provide you with some advice on that. But anyway, there are other issues, plant and equipment such as HVAC. You know, how do we specify that in the future? And, you know, really each of the regions is different, so it'll be a region-specific response to climate change. So what's over the horizon? Anyone want to have a guess? What do you reckon's over the horizon? Come on, someone have a crack. Well, definitely. But I didn't cover that one. Anything else? Renewables and sustainability, right? What are we being told? We're being told, put solar on your roofs. You know, we need more wind farms. So how have we responded to that? Who's got solar on their roof at home? I know I do. Who's got a battery that goes with the solar? I do. Okay. What are we seeing across the sector? We're seeing, you know, a couple of front-of-meter solar farms which export to the grid. But we're mostly seeing behind-the-meter microgrids or, you know, rooftop installations. Why is that important? I'll explain why it's important in a minute. But battery energy storage, yeah, there's some at campuses, but this is likely to increase in the future. Who has a power purchase agreement? So with Rand Energy, where you buy green power, so it's an outsourced green power generation and supply model. Who's got a deal like that? Anyone? I know a couple of universities do. Okay. So how does renewable energy impact the grid? Anyone seen the duck curve before? Give me an indication if you know what the duck curve is. Yeah? Well, basically, it shows electricity consumption, right? So in the morning, we wake up, we put the kettle on, have a shower, make our toast, so on and so forth. So there's a bit of a load, you know, from 6 a.m., 7, 8, you know, it starts dropping off, and that's when the sun sort of starts to, you know, feed the solar, right? So the lines you see on the duck are basically what the thermal power plant load is, right? So that drops off during daylight hours because there's more and more renewable energy coming into the grid, right? You'd think that would be okay, but it actually causes instability in the grid. Trouble with the power plants, so the thermal coal plants that we've traditionally had, they're getting older, but they really, really struggle to vary their load significantly, right? So the most common causes of blackouts, I'll let you see that, but see who's the speed reader in the room. What are the key causes of power outages? Come on, it's not that hard. Come on, help me out here. Could be. Any other suggestions? Yeah, weather events and ageing transmission infrastructure. Who remembers what happened in Victoria during a windstorm a couple of years ago? Remember those 66 kV massive stanchions? They were just bent over like plasticine. Right, caused massive outage. You remember that? What did we see last week and the week before in Queensland? Massive weather event causing significant power disruption. The other trouble with baseload production with thermal plants at the moment is these plants are 50 years old and they're starting to break down. Okay, we've heard the government talk about all sorts of stuff like nuclear energy. That's years away. We've got to keep these plants running and we've got to manage that input of renewable with these plants. We've got to manage that. But we've got to recognise that, life of flicking on the switch is probably not as simple in the future as it has been now or in the past, right? And that has implications for us all. Greg, anything you'd like to add to, grid instability and the like?
I think there's quite a few issues there. As you said, a lot of those assets are ageing, so a lot of the outages that occur, particularly in summer, are unplanned. Just that we've got a less, and because also with, as you saw with the duck curve, there's a lot more intermediate. The load is going to vary through the year, but of course we have got a greater reliance on intermediate type generation, which is making these thermal plants less economic. But it's quite a difficult period, and inevitably that is going to lead to a lot of challenges for the grid.
Indeed. Greg and I had a meeting with Professor Adrian Panau, who's the professor of, or the head of the Energy Transition Research Group at UQ, and we're going, Adrian, how do we? What's the answer to this? And he said, it's kind of simple, son. No pun intended with that. But that's what he did say. Larger scale storage, battery storage, because what we've got to do is we've got to manage that energy into the grid. Okay? So don't be surprised, if some of these proposals come across your desks in the future, right? What about research as an emerging risk? Or the wrong type of research? So, we could talk about medical research, agricultural research, GMOs, it's all important stuff. But we'll take that as given. And what I want to do is I want to talk about research in the energy front because it's aligned to the theme that we've been talking about. And it's important, right? So there's a lot of hydrogen research going on at the moment. What's the LEL, Greg, for hydrogen? Can you remember? 5%?
5% is a very large range.
Yeah. So small amount of hydrogen is very explosive. Okay, it's difficult to work with. And I think what the outcome eventually is going to be is hydrogen will be used for bulk transport energy. So powering trains and, B-doubles, that sort of thing, rather than power generation. What we are seeing is a lot of new solar innovation, solar cell innovation. So concentrated solar thermal, which works during the day and stores heat at night. Printable and paintable solar cells. That'll be the next thing. We'll be painting our roofs, and making energy out of the paint, right? There's a thing called tandem solar cells, which is a combination of silicon and perovskite. Now, perovskite's an interesting mineral. It's a calcium titanium oxide. But when you combine the silicon together with the perovskite, you get a high efficiency of solar conversion, right? So there's a lot of that sort of research happening at the moment. There's new battery technology, and I think Chi down at Wollongong, boys are doing a lot of work with sodium batteries, right? Trouble with sodium batteries is that the energy density is not as great as lithium. It's much safer, and sodium's very plentiful, but until such time as we can get that energy density equivalent to a lithium batteries are still king for energy storage. Okay? But the seed I wanted to plant in everybody's mind is, what do we do? What happens with those solar cells that come off the roof? And you think about how many solar cells you've got at your university, right? What happens when they come off the roof? Where do they go? Where do solar cells go to die? Anyone tell me? I'll tell you, in a stockpile, right? And hopefully not to landfill. Same with lithium-ion batteries. What do you do with spent batteries? Well, most universities got a battery collection and storage protocol, but what happens after we transport them off-site, right? What about e-waste? How good are we at e-waste? You know, we just close our eyes and forget about what happens to all this waste, right? The secret, and I reckon one of the best research projects you could be undertaken in universities would be to figure out how we recycle and how we extract all of the valuable componentry out of this stuff and reuse it. Right, the Accord. This is the last over-the-horizon risk I'm going to talk about. And I've entitled it Balancing Reality, Risk and Aspiration. And I'm only going to pick two things here. First one is 108% increase in student numbers on Australian campuses by 2050. Right? And the next one is an increase in research and development, preferably with translational outcomes. Okay? Let's talk about 108% increase in foot traffic on campuses. What does that mean? Right? What does that mean in reality? Well, if we look at ageing infrastructure, climate change and energy security, and we imagine the confluence of conditions, so that's over the horizon risks and on the radar risks, if we look at the confluence of conditions that may conspire to challenge the aspirations and targets in the Accord, we're thinking, oh my goodness, how's this going to work out? So we've got ageing infrastructure, we've got more students on campus, there's going to be more pressure, we've got a asset maintenance backlog deficit that we're struggling to control. Ooh, this could be problematic. So I think the whole purpose of this discussion is really to help you understand some of the risks that are emerging and how they may impact you and what the risk landscape looks like and how to plan for that in the future. So what are those risks that we need to manage? So ageing infrastructure, more students, more pressure, reduced fitness for purpose, that equals a reputation risk potentially. A student experience risk. So we're cramming more and more students onto campuses that are less and less fit for purpose if we don't do something about it now. That reputation risk potentially translates to lower intakes, and lower intakes translates to less revenue. And that sort of becomes a spiral, a death spiral. Climate change. We know we're going to be exposed to more and more natural perils, more intense, more frequent. There's going to be more pressure on heating and cooling, and construction and material selection risks become, critical. I mean, Glenn, we were talking about this morning. Your asset maintenance backlog deficit, and we were talking about that HVAC example. Could you maybe just explain a little bit about that?
What we were talking about was the strategic asset management decisions that the institutions are making. And, if the students are wanting to spend more time on their campuses and the buildings are staying open for longer to accommodate that, but to accommodate that, then you need to run your plant, your equipment for longer, which is putting more pressure on those. And if our finance teams or our renewal teams are, using a straight line depreciation and suggesting for a HVAC system that they'll replace that in 25 years, what happens is it fails well before that, and you end up increasing that backlog. And what it's doing is it starts straining all of the other equipment that's trying to compensate for it. So I guess it's trying to balance what you're doing, how you're investing, and I guess the needs of the institutions to meet, the products that you're putting out to people.
Thanks, mate. Look, I said we weren't going to delve into the detail of this, and we're not. But there is so much detail that sits below some of this, and we're happy to talk to you any time about these issues, okay? The last one here, energy security. Well, with grid instability comes less reliable power. With less reliable power comes potential for core business interruption. And what's your core business? It's research and teaching, right? That's a risk we're going to have to manage in the future. And finally, being an old rugby player and a coach, perfect preparation prevents poor performance. You play the way you train, okay? So I think the message we want to leave you with this afternoon is to understand the risks and plan to manage them, okay? Both on the radar and over the horizon risks can inform strategic and campus master planning outcomes now to help achieve sector resilience in the future. So basically, get a grip on these risks now, understand them, understand how they relate to your campuses and your financial situation at the campuses, and plan to do something about it. Imagine what you want to be in the future and consider those risks and, how you can manage them so that they don't become issues for you later.